Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As we gather today, I'd like to acknowledge the lands we are gathering from are the traditional homelands of many indigenous nations. Acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from these territories, and honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people still connected to the lands on which we're all joining this webinar. Thank you for joining us today for today's conversations on translating scholarly research and critical analysis for the public. This will be the first and what we hope will be a series of events on scholars writing for the public. Later in today's discussion, you will have an opportunity to register for a follow-up workshop specifically on writing pitches for Spark Magazine, our wonderful sponsor for today's webinar. But first, let's talk about the whys and hows of writing for the public. I'm Dr. Rita Shaw, soon to be professor of criminology at Eastern Michigan University and an outgoing editor for Spark Magazine, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. I'm joined by three brilliant scholars who have all written for the public in various ways. And before getting into the heart of the conversation, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to please briefly introduce yourself. And as part of your introduction, could you share why you believe scholars should be writing beyond academic outlets? And Manushka, would you like to start first?
Absolutely. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Manushka Celeste, and I am an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, in gender women studies. My background is in communication and media studies. Um, and I'll talk more about this, but I think it's literally our job to learn and to share what we've learned. And so I'm hoping that folks on the webinar will be excited and inspired to find ways to take what they're learning and researching to share it with the public, because that's literally the work.
Thank you. Kevin, would you like to follow?
Hi, yes, I'm Kevin Coakley. I am professor of psychology and associate chair for diversity initiatives at the University of Michigan. I believe that scholars should be writing beyond academic outlets because it is a way to really expose your ideas and your thinking to folks who would likely otherwise not ever be exposed to it. I'm reminded of someone who's really who was really big in my field, Dr. Joseph White. And Dr. Joseph White was affectionately referred to as the father or godfather of Black psychology. And he shared a story when he published his very first piece. He did not publish it, and keep in mind he was one of the very first Black folks who had a PhD in psychology. When he published his first piece, it was not in a journal. He published it in Ebony magazine, and when he was asked why he chose to publish it there, he said because he wanted to make sure that his ideas got to the communities that he was most concerned about, and he knew that certainly at that time most Black families had copies of Ebony magazine in their homes, and so he wanted to make sure that he was able to reach out to those communities. So that's why I think that it's important that we as scholars write beyond academic outlets to reach the communities that we hope to be able to impact.
Great, thank you. And then Edvish?
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Edwige Jean-François. I'm Executive Director at the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora. It's a mouthful, so we call it CSAD for short. And I come to this webinar by way of having been a career journalist and now being part of academia. As a journalist, we relied extensively on scholars for our information, for really as a guide to what are the important issues that we need to talk about and who are the trusted voices that can contextualize them. So at this time, especially when we've seen the proliferation of misinformation, not knowing whom to trust, where to go for accurate information, the proliferation of information actually has made the availability of information, I think, something that really, if one is not able to really synthesize it and contextualize it, can really pose some challenges. So I think scholars are very, very, very important voices in the public square to build trust, to serve as a guide to folks. And I think scholarly voices are needed and important. And I think this webinar is also important in terms of how to bridge that gap between scholarship and writing and sharing information that's digestible for the public.
Thank you all very much. Before I move on to the next question, just a reminder to our webinar participants, if you have a question, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible very shortly. But Advij, I'd like to start by building on what you just spoke about in terms of the value of academics writing for the public. And I wonder if you could elaborate more on what the value of essays and op-eds, et cetera, written by academics are and how they fit alongside traditional journalistic work.
Well, I think it has very important merit. As I was saying, think about how information has proliferated. You know, when I started in journalism, I remember the machine spitting out news copy that you'd have to run to whoever was anchoring the program or whoever was leading a particular broadcast or journalist. And now we've come to a time where there is so much information. You know, every Joe citizen can be a voice, an authority, a journalist, if you will. And so, how do you decipher what is the right information, what is the trusted information? So historically, universities come vetted with the voices that are scholars that have spent the time doing the research, doing the legwork. So as a start, that's a key source of information. You know, we rely as journalists on published reports and documentation. So there is a system of making sure that the information is vetted, and perhaps we'll get more into that. But when you're in a time where history is living history, and there's a particular topic that you want to research, to me, it's always been that universities and academia was a very first stop of exploration, from books that have been written to shorter materials, essays. And so when you think about the public, you know, many academics are head down, writing books, doing years of research in some cases, and that information that you're gathering that will end up in a book that will be important, that people can hold as something really tactile. But what of in the now, right? What of in the now? How to get that information in the public hand to address the immediacy of what's going on. And that's through op-ed, that's through articles, that's through whether it's television interviews or podcasts. There's a multitude of ways. And academics are a really important voice. You know, academics spend a lot of time gathering information and doing the research, involving students, and having ready, almost like a ready working group to test out some of these ideas. And so it's very important. And I think part of communicating that information is also being able to step outside of academia as well, to touch the tea leaves, if you will, to see what people are talking about. So I can elaborate more on that, but suffice it to say that the basic tenets of communicating information to the public, you know, we have 5 things in journalism that we focus on: is the who, what, where, why, and how. And that's the beginning, really, of the basic communication to the public.
Thank you. And actually, that's a great transition for my question for both Manushka and Kevin. Because as we know, academics face somewhat of a catch-22. On one hand, many of us feel that our work should be available to the public, and we also know much of the public wants to hear from us and wants to hear how the work that we do can impact policy. On the other hand, academia broadly, not all of it, but good chunks of it, has not been very open to public-facing scholarship, let alone recognizing its value as part of tenure and promotion reviews. And so I'm curious for both of you, why did you make the decision to produce this type of work, and how does your public-facing work fit within the larger scope of your academic scholarship?
Well, I was going to let Manisha go first, but I guess I'll I guess I'll go first. Um, so for me, I've got to take you back to when I was a young assistant professor. I've been a professor now for about 28 years. And when I was a young assistant professor at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and I was working on putting together my tenure dossier, and part of what they asked you, or at least at that time, what they asked you to do for your tenure dossier was talk about future plans and like where did you see yourself, where do you see yourself going? And I remember, in my tenure dossier saying that, among other things, that I wanted to be a public intellectual. Now you have to understand that, yeah, at that time, when I said that, you would see all of these sort of talking heads, on seeing, Michael Eric Dyson, Cornell West, Bell Hooks, those sort of folks were always like, on, in the public's eye. And I remember sort of like watching them and thinking to myself, wow, I would love to be in that position, to be able to sort of be referred to, called upon to talk about things that I may not necessarily be an expert on, but I could say something. So, and so anyway, I got promoted and tenured, never really knew how to enter into that world. Fast forward many, many years, I go through, University of, Missouri, then I ended up at the University of Texas at Austin. And while at the University of Texas at Austin, I had gotten tenured and promoted from associate professor to full professor. And we were told about this opportunity to participate in what was referred to as the op-ed project. And because I was in a leadership position at the time, and because I was a full professor, I was invited to participate in this op-ed project. The op-ed project, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a project that where professional journalists work with academics to teach them how to write opinion editorial pieces. As academics, we are so ingrained in writing sort of like in, academic language that we don't oftentimes know how to effectively communicate what we know to the public without lapsing into jargon. And so this opportunity to work with professional journalists was, for me, it was life changing. And I don't say that, in a hyperbolic manner, because I really wanted to be able to know how to sort of take what I have in my head and to sort of write it in a way that my family, my friends, the folks that I grew up with would be able to have access to and read and understand. So I went through this year-long training, met with these professional journalists about 4 or 5 times over the course of a year. During that time, I think I ended up writing like 10 op-eds in the course of that one year. Like I was like ecstatic. And the skills that I learned from that experience, I have kept with me, and I have sort of continued to use, and to really, essentially, whenever there is any sort of major social issue that I feel like I have some insights on based on my training as a psychologist, I will address. And so and I have to admit that I had some, as a full professor, as a tenured full professor, I no longer had to worry about going through the T and P, the P or the P and T process. And I know that sometimes for more junior scholars, there's always this question of, can I do this? Should I do this? Particularly as you sort of pointed out, Rita, it has not always been valued by academia. And in fact, there is some sentiment that's very much against it, because of the view that this is not rigorous scholarship. This is, you're just sharing your opinion, and that is not something that we want to sort of endorse as an academic institution. But I would counter by saying that if we want to really be able to influence public policy and public attitudes, we have to get out of the academic ivory tower, and we have to be able to sort of speak in a way that is accessible to the masses. And we can't do that continuing to just publish in academic journals and publishing books that only a small percentage of people will ever read within our disciplines. And so that's why I made the decision to engage in public scholarship.
That's great. I always regret going second because I'm like, yes, everything you said, yes. I will share just a tiny bit of how I got here. So I went to the University of Washington in Seattle, and we actually had a class that was called Public Scholarship in Gender and Women's Studies. And so I was like, oh, you all think this is important. And so I take it for granted that we're supposed to be doing this. And a part of that also comes from, so if you know the history of Black studies and gender women's studies, communication, these are all fields that have always been engaged with the public, right? Not as like sort of a separate thing, but we've always been together. So when I teach Black studies, I use a short video from Karenga, who's the founder of Kwanzaa, and he's citing Mary Bethune-Cookman, who says, knowledge is never for knowledge's sake, knowledge is for human sake. And if you go and read her will, one of the things she writes, like, I leave you the thirst for knowledge. And so this idea that we have the privilege of reading and doing research. It's one that comes with the responsibility of sharing what that work is. She says, knowledge is the prime need of the hour. And this was a long time ago, and I think that quote still holds. So communication, which is my initial training field, grows out of scholars fleeing fascism in Europe and working together to figure out how to create communication strategies to help garner support to fight that. So at its birth, the field has been engaged with the public. My first piece as an academic was in the Seattle Times. And it was in response to news coverage of the earthquake in Haiti. So I'm in grad school and the world, of course, falls apart. So I wanted to tell a story and to call attention to the impact of the earthquake itself, but also some of the images, which had been in sort of news history unprecedented, right, with what was showed. And so I wanted to give a Haitian context, but also an academic context to say, here's the history of these images. Here's the history of this place. Here's the history of our relationship with these stories, right? To think about it differently. And I got great responses, but I also got hate mail. And all of the hate mail confirmed what I knew to be true. So the hate mail was like, of course it's a terrible place. All the hate mail was like super racist. And I'm like, oh, this is great, right? Because you get immediate feedback. And so it's confirmation that the theories that I was using were right, unfortunately. Um, a second part of that happens when I went into the classroom to teach first graders media literacy. And the research says, like there are certain ages when they learn certain things. And so in the classroom with first graders, I was like, oh, the theory is wrong. Because these young folks had the cartoons and movies memorized and they'd attached identity stuff to them. And so it was sooner than we thought. And so even going in those spaces, we can also check our research, right, to make sure that it works. And the literacy part actually became my first piece in Spark because I'm really interested in how young people navigate the world. And so the great news for me, I didn't ever think it was taboo because the UW Women's Studies Department, General Women's Studies Department, made it normal. Communication at the university made it normal. And you'll see all kinds of public scholarship centers and certificates. And so I think I came out in a good time where this was in my areas valued. And I hope increasingly in other areas that people will understand its value, but also its urgency, right? So the work is to give context. So if there's something happening in this moment and you all have expertise, we should have access to that, right? So we can make better decisions, so we can move differently and have different conversations. And so I want for us to, all of you on the webinar, to, if you are department chairs and deans, to normalize, right, the work that we're doing to make sure that people have access to what we offer, but also because now people are like, what do academics do anyways, right? And so we shouldn't now have to justify the work. People should know what we already do so that the public can support it versus now trying to run and explain to folks what we do.
Yeah, I love that. I love that a lot. And actually on that note, Kevin, I wanted to follow up with you real quick because you recently used publicly accessible outlets such as Psychology Today, USA Today, your local news outlets to share your perspective on current issues. Across these pieces, how have you grounded your scholarship expertise to offer informed perspectives? And also, if there are maybe 2 to 3 insights you would offer those who are early in their public writing journey, what would you say to them?
Um, so when when I first started writing public scholarship, I focused initially on my local news outlets. So when I was in Austin, Texas, I would write for the Austin American Statesman, San Antonio News Express, Dallas Morning News. Local local or relatively local pieces. And then as I you know, continue to write more and more, I started to target more national outlets. And it was interesting with USA Today. They actually contacted me, and it was at the time when it was at the height of the debate on critical race theory. And so they contacted me and asked me, they wanted to do like a feature series on critical race theory. They wanted to have a pro position and a con position, and they asked me if I would be willing to write the pro position. And the individual who wrote the composition was Christopher Rufo, whose name you might be familiar with. He's the person who really has been the architect of the dismantling of DEI. Um, so at any rate, I said yes, I would be happy to. And when I wrote that pro critical race theory piece, part of what I did was I grounded it within my experience as a professor of psychology and Black studies, because at the time I had joint appointments, and I commented on how I had been a professor of psychology and Black studies for over 2 decades, and that the idea that talking about systemic racism is inherently harmful to students, I just categorically challenged that. I said that, in my class, I said, first of all, I don't even necessarily use the term critical race theory, but the concepts that I talk about all address sort of systemic issues of bias and discrimination and racism. And I talked about how, in my capacity as a professor, I was able to address issues of systemic racism without alienating or ostracizing any group of students in my class. And I've been able to do it successfully for over 2 decades. So it was nice to be able to sort of use my positionality as a professor and as a Black professor, to be able to sort of address that. And with psychology today, that was interesting because, as psychology today is, for those who may not be familiar with, is a really, it's like a blog, a large sort of blog website where folks can sort of like write blog entries. And so they reached out to me and asked me if I would be interested in creating my own blog entries. And so I created a Black psychology blog. And what I do with that is kind of nice because I'm able to, address any major sort of, social, psychological, political issue that I think Black psychology touches, which is, I think, basically everything or any and everything. And and I have used that to address issues such as when Kamala Harris was running, and when she was being challenged on the authenticity of her Blackness. I wrote a blog about that. The politics of sort of Blackness. I wrote it, when there was some kids, Black kids being discriminated against because of the way that they wore their hair. I wrote a blog about the politics of Black hair. Um, I've used it to address how Black folks, the psychological impact of having to watch videos of police brutality and how we experience vicarious trauma. So I've taken advantage of really used it to try to educate the public about issues that I know as a Black psychologist that I think would be beneficial. And if I could share this one, interesting anecdote. I uh, During the time when Kanye West was really at the peak of his craziness, I wrote a piece called "The Self-Destruction of Kanye West," and my angle was, while so many people were focusing on his anti-Semitic rantings, I actually focused on his internalized anti-Blackness, because that, I believed, had not been sufficiently addressed. Wrote that piece. I had no idea the impact of that piece. It today it continues to be my most highly read piece, and as a result of that piece, maybe a year or two later, I was contacted by, of all places, TMZ. The For those of you who are into pop culture, TMZ was working on a documentary about Kanye, they came across that piece and they read it and they decided that they wanted to include me in the documentary. Now, again, these are not like, serious issues dealing with like racism and sexism and oppression, but Kanye West is, a major, not major cultural figure that has, I think, impact on, our on the culture in this country. So I accepted the invitation, and TMZ actually, came to my house, brought the camera crew, and I was able to sort of be a part of the documentary. So I say all that to say that these outlets, Psychology Today, USA Today, local outlets, and others have I've been able to use my expertise as a Black psychologist in ways that help educate the public about the things that I have known that I know from my training as a psychologist.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear how you both have used your scholarship to do the public work.
If I could,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, really, if I could maybe, I want to share just one other thing, and Manisha, because she said something that really reminded me of this, that in terms of an insight that I would offer, if if you choose to go this route, you need to understand that once you make yourself publicly accessible, then you should be prepared for the incoming. You need to be prepared for the negativity. When I wrote that piece about critical race, and I also wrote a piece for USA Today about the Black Lives Matter movement. And in fact, when I wrote that piece, I received a lot of hate mail. I remember one of the stories that I oftentimes share is that I remember writing that piece, and the very next morning, opening my email, and I remember there was an email that I received from an individual who did not try to hide his identity, and the only thing that the email said was the N word, written about
Mhm.
174, 175 times. I know because I counted each and every one of them. Because the person was mad that I dared to defend Black Lives Matter. I had an email that basically that threatened me, that challenged me to a fight, and told me that things it would not work out too well for me should I take up the challenge. So if you engage, if you enter into the realm of public scholarship, depending on what you are sort of talking about, particularly if it's something that's a more provocative topic, dealing with like race, gender, etc., you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you're going to receive some really nasty responses, and that kind of goes with the territory.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that insight. I think it's interesting how both you and Manushka have had both those responses, but also it sounds like doing the public scholarship has also opened up some doors in really interesting ways. And so to follow up on that, Advish, I'd like to turn to you as someone who has been a national international journalist. You understand this industry and the saturation of information across digital spaces probably better than most people. And so I'd just like to ask, do you have any advice for scholars who want to become public writers for domestic or international audiences, or any recommendations in terms of best practices, maybe how to structure pieces, how to get the attention, readers' attention, or just any other thoughts you have on sort of what makes a good story for the public?
Sure. I want to start off by actually picking up on something both Manushka and Kevin mentioned. First, there's that visceral reaction, right? Something is happening, whether it's the Haiti earthquake, and I was there for a month when it happened, and on the ground, seeing how devastating it is, and what Kevin mentioned, as well as once you get into that public square, uh, be ready for the incoming, right? And I use that term because it's almost impossible these days to say anything that's neutral, even when it's backed up by fact. And so it is all the more important to make sure that your writing, your publication, your op-ed is solidly grounded in fact, while obviously as an opinion piece, it's sort of your own reaction, your own personal step on it. I mean, my journalistic background is really across many forms, from local news, domestic, international breaking news, disasters, politics. covered the White House for part of my career. So really having a sense of what is the pulse of journalism and news across many different facets. Having said that, the industry changes and it evolves constantly. So practices that 10 years ago worked do not work anymore. Increasingly, print journalism used to be the storied way of communicating, and it's still very important. But the industry has become very much multi-platform. So there's an opportunity also to expand, in addition to the op-eds, to have a social platform, to have a way of communicating directly with the public. So what I would say is, as a scholar entering into the journalistic public information space, the first thing is really to find your lane. And sometimes it's not a singular lane, right? Manushka writes about gender studies, has that expertise. She's also a woman. She's also Haitian American. So there are many lanes that she can navigate. The same for Kevin as a professor, as with psychology training. So there are many avenues, and sometimes it means testing the waters at first to see what voice will resonate with the public. I suggest starting locally. Kevin mentioned his own journey, from local to domestic to getting the op-ed training. So the first thing, really, the ability to look around and see what is happening around you. How does your own expertise as a scholar fit into what is going on, and see how you can amplify it. Scholars travel. They go to places, they observe. I think one of the things that, for me as a journalist, I was always, on a plane somewhere. And now being in academia, I interact with researchers who are spending time researching their topic, putting together their books and whatnot. But at the same time, as you travel, there's the ability to infuse the scholarship, the knowledge that you've built with actually your own observances. So I would really start there. What is the story in the public square? What is the issue that means a lot to you? And what is the fact that you can bring to it? The other thing that's really important, as a journalist, I always had the backing of the news organization that I'm working for. So if a story, you get the angry emails, or you get people who have a different way of thinking about it, there's the protection of your news organization. So as a scholar, it's important to examine what is the support that you have from your institution. It's one thing to go out there and make your voice known, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily, depending on your role and how you function, that you may need buy-in from the institution, but also that support, because putting your voice out there leaves you exposed, right? It can leave you in a vulnerable position, could potentially threaten, your position. So it's important to have an understanding of the landscape, that the foray that you're going into. So best practices would be, again, what's going on, what's happening in your environment, what is it that you think you can add to build on the story, be well researched on the topic, because oftentimes you may approach it, you may think you're the first person sharing this information, but it's already been shared. So one of the best ways is to find the lane that you can navigate, and obviously the anatomy of writing a good pitch. And we get a lot of pitches. Some of them we open, some of them we do not. It's important to have like a subject line that's captivating, and really be able to sell the story that you want to write or you want to share, and really in a sentence, to just really captivate and just say who you are, what you bring to that topic, and how you plan on fleshing it out. Once you have an established voice, like Manushka or Kevin, journalists will come to you, as been enumerated, because journalism relies on scholars, relies on the research that you have, the expertise that you have, the opinion that you have. And as journalists, that's the information that we use. We are purveyors of information, but we're not the experts. So just know that you have an important voice, that your expertise matters. So it's an ability to own it and find ways to pitch it and get through that door. The other thing that's really important that's been mentioned here is telling a story, writing, whether you're on a podcast, communicating in a way that you could really tell the story to your buddy, and getting out of the academic language, which is beautiful and wonderful and sounds really, really smart. But when you're having that public information space, when you're in that space, it's the ability to imagine that whoever you're communicating with, that there are multiple things going on in their lives, in their day, and what they're thinking of. So how can I break through? If I were telling the story to my mother, my grandmother, my relative, how would I tell the story? So it's important to speak in a way that's very tactile, very understandable. Another what I've come to find is that academic books are really expensive. you know so uh, you may have the most wonderful book and research. It's the ability to really, how do you get it in somebody's hands who's not taking your class, who's not a university, who's not another scholar. And so the ability to take one's work and really synthesize it, break it down in a way to make it usable is really, really important. And also there's the ability through different platforms, whether it's Medium, to have your own agency. It's great if you can get, your CNN, your Washington Post, your New York Times, whatever publication that you value, to ask you to write a piece or come knocking at your door. But there are tons of ways to build your own public platform as a way to get the media to come to you once you've established that footprint. It's that old saying, build it and they will come. And so what makes a good story, right? That's always the important question, because what may be a good story to you is not necessarily a good story for public consumption. And even as journalists, we wrestle with it as well. Sometimes you have a good story, but how do you tell that story best? And I want to go back to the first, really what makes a good story is, what is the broader impact of what you think you believe this story do? Does it impact anybody beyond your particular interest? And if so, who does it impact? In what way does it impact? What are the intersections that can make the story broader, right? And we see this all the time in the public square. Because essentially the world has collapsed. Everything international is now national. Everything local is now domestic, as you can see. I mean, some of the current ongoing stories, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the repatriation of refugees from South Africa. It's an international story, but it has domestic implications. So I would say that's really important, because that's also enables you to find a larger audience beyond the academic audience, beyond the domestic audience. And also the international audience is important as well. There are a multitude of platforms, online platforms, that can enable academics to build a rapport, to build a portfolio of international journalism contribution. That's also really important. And and I would say one thing that's also important, to be tenacious, and be committed to the story that you want to tell. And when you also approach a journalist, having that understanding that there's the academic knowledge based on research and scholarship and data, and there's also the experience the journalist has where they've been on the ground, they've been at these places, you know, they've met some of these people, so they know the story in a very organic, tactile, immediate way. And as a scholar, you've had the opportunity to spend that time and research the material really deeply. So engaging a journalist is to say, hey, I know you're focused on this particular arena. This is the benefit of my experience having looked into this, and this is how I think we can come together to amplify and elevate that story. And you know, to go back to the Haiti story, the quake that happened in 2010, when you know the entire world, if you will, descended on Haiti. And so that was the breaking news, the immediacy of information, the raw, the visceral. And more, once it settles, it's an opportunity to ground some of that and looking at the historic nature of what happened and what over the years has contributed to Haiti being where it is, right? And some of that is developing even now, where not long ago France acknowledged you know, historically what had happened to Haiti and what has led it to this moment. So look for these opportunities to bring new scholarship and these opportunities to make your voice heard and connect to what's happening in the here and now.
Wonderful. Fantastic advice. Thank you very much. I think one aspect that can get a little tough for those who are writing is sort of understanding the background of what happens. And so for our last question before we move to Q&A in the next couple of minutes, Manushka, you're one of our editors and one of our outgoing editors at Spark Magazine at University of Michigan, and so I'm hoping you can offer some behind the scenes insight for our scholars. We're gonna put the link in the chat for Spark Pitches for those of you who are interested in learning more. But as we're doing that, could you maybe speak for a couple of minutes on what scholars should know about the submission and review process with public outlets?
Awesome, thank you. I love the idea of being tenacious. That's been lingering for a few seconds. So I've been very fortunate to have, I guess, 2 rounds of working on Spark Magazine, and a part of what's really great about it is I get to read all kinds of things that I knew nothing about. And so I guess that's why we're here, right? It's for us to learn from our colleagues. And so the first thing to know is you can follow the link, is to make the pitch, even if it's something that you're like, I'm not sure, you know, like make a pitch. And so once folks get the pitches, so it goes through the review process, there often is a curator or curators who say, I want to do uh, a themed thing on X, right? And so we had a theme, a co-edited, a themed section a few years back on CRT, right? I was coming out of Florida, and so that was the time to do it. So we'll get the pitches, and once folks are selected, you get assigned to an editor who's not necessarily the curator. So I think what's important to know is even if it's not with us, to make the pitch, right? To know the audience and to be ready to make a timely contribution. And so with Spark, as an editor myself, I'm always wanting to be helpful, right? So this is very different than blind peer review, where you send your stuff out um, and reader number 2 tells you to stop writing because it's terrible, right? We've all had reviewer number 2, right? It's the opposite of that, where we're looking to make the piece work. And so you'll get an editor who responds to your work multiple times. You'll work with the folks behind the scenes also to get feedback. And we're reading for a few things, but primarily we're thinking about the theme and the audience. It's written for a public audience. And so if I may offer just a few tips on if you're doing Spark or anywhere else, as a scholar wanting to write, is to be very, very clear, right? It's the opposite of our kind of writing where we have like 30 pages and then the findings, right? So to be very clear, what do you want people to know? What is the takeaway? Also, what do you want them to do with the information? So for me, when I was thinking about media literacy, I want people to teach young people how to read media better, right? Especially if they're like watching cartoons by themselves or they have the iPad with the games. What do you want people to do with the information? Also, the editors would be looking for readability, right? And so always say it plain. There's a way that we are celebrated for using jargon, and it's not helpful. So to avoid jargon, to avoid words that are discipline specific, and we've heard before, right? Can your cousin or your neighbor or someone at the farmer's market, can they read it and understand what you're saying? And to not necessarily feel like you're making an argument, but you're telling a story and you're sharing your findings from your actual work. um, you'll get feedback. Again, it's very different than peer review. So to be really open to the conversation versus the one-sided feedback, right? Because I always say when I write my notes, I'm thinking about the audience. Would they understand this, right? I'm thinking about the audience. Can they ask, so that's sort of the lens through which most of the editors will go through is like, are you making your point? Are you sharing your information? Can the audience understand what you're saying? And so the last sort of thing I always look for is also who cares, right? My my PhD advisor love to say like, who cares? I'm like, I care, don't you care? And that's a different thing, right? You want the reader to be like, why does this matter, right? So connect the dots for the reader instead of just telling them data and expecting them to connect the dots. So for example, we know a lot of things because scholars have done this already, right? So we had data from COVID-19 around labor, and we learned, shock and awe, right, that it was racialized and gendered in class. Women lost money, right? Women lost promotions. So we knew this because scholars connected the dots for us. They gave us the data and then said, here's what this means. We also have research that's coming out that talks about how women who are in heterosexual relationships benefit less from being married in terms of health outcomes, economic gain, and social gain. And so so what, right? Tell us what that means and how that impacts society and our structures and what we can do about it. So there's a lot of information that kind of floats in your job writing to our audience, which is very broad, is to tell us what it means. And sort of really walk us through it as if you were in the farmer's market picking out oranges. You're like, yeah, did you know this? And you're like, really? Wow. And then tell me more, right? Think about it sort of in that kind of storytelling way. And I think that the last part is, if you're writing for us, is to know that you have something valuable to offer. You have spent days, weeks, and years studying something that we don't have time to study. And so what is the thing that you want to offer us? To be very, very, very clear about that, and to be sort of open to sharing it. And for all of these, Spark, whether you're using sort of a newspaper or using sort of other outlets, the main thing is to make the pitch, but also be ready to have a conversation. None of this is like one-sided. So when I made my first pitch ever on the other side of journalism to the Seattle Times, I was like terrified, right? I'm like, I am 20 something. I don't know what's happening. I'm crying all the time about my real life. And the editors will engage with you, right? So just know that whatever the pitch is, it's a conversation. And it's a relationship that's mutually beneficial. So to be really open and flexible with the people that you're pitching to.
Thank you for that. So we literally have 5 minutes for Q&A. And I'm going to keep us to that 5 minutes because I don't want folks on the webinar to have to go later than they were expecting at 1. And so we're going to sort of compile a bunch of questions that we've gotten together. And we've gotten several questions in terms of speed and timing. And so what advice do you have for scholars who are slow writers? It seems like the people who are most successful at writing op-eds and the like are super fast writers. Do you have any tips on how to practice becoming a fast writer? And then on a similar note, how do you balance urgency in writing? For instance, seeing people talk about a topic that maybe aren't accurately talking about it, which we see unfortunately a lot. It's creating more confusion or sensationalization, and you want to address the conversation or ground the discourse, but also know that as graduate students and particularly early career faculty who are here and who want to engage with this work, they still have to build credibility and professionalism. So again, 5 minutes. I want us to go to 12:57. So I'll let y'all sort of divide up how you want to talk about it. But if there's any parts of that you would like to address.
Well, I don't know that I have the the best response for this. I mean, I don't consider myself necessarily a fast writer, though I I will say that because I've written so many op-eds and because I went to the training, it's I have it's almost formulaic in terms of, I know I start off with a lead, and I go through the steps. And so I have a structure that assists me in writing. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I do, and again, I don't necessarily recommend this for everyone, but when I'm in a op-ed writing mode, I literally am not doing anything else because I'm not good at multitasking. I know some people are, and that's not me. So when I'm working on an op-ed, I am totally focused on writing that, and usually when I do that, I can get it done within 2 or 3 days. But that means not doing other things. Again, other people may have different writing styles, and that might not be necessary for them. But just for me personally, that's how I'm able to be relatively, productive with writing op-eds.
Anushka or Advish?
I'm wondering if you could repeat the questions because I think they condensed and my brain exploded as I was trying to keep track of them.
Sure. So questions about, how do you have any advice on how to become a faster writer or balance the urgency in writing, given the way that these topics sort of come up? And then in terms of, or alternatively, when we see people writing things that are confusing or sensationalizing or not completely accurate, how do you then respond, particularly for those who are grad students or early career faculty who are also still trying to build their credibility and professionalism?
So I can go to the last question about folks who are um, graduate students wanting to respond and to write. So one of the things that I think we should remove off the table is the idea that you have to have a PhD to be
Mhm.
a scholar. And this again, like if you read Patricia Hill Collins, much of her work is about unearthing Black women's intellectual contributions, primarily because we were not allowed to be in institutions, right? So if you are if you don't have a doctorate, it does not mean that you are not an intellectual and that you don't have anything to offer. So I would invite you to read more of her work, and sort of put aside that idea, because if you have research that you're doing that is helpful, find a way to share it. You don't have to have a doctorate to be an intellectual. I want that to be very, very, very clear. And also with the idea of like, how do you sort of write quickly? I used to write quickly. Now I don't, because my brain has turned past 40. And so a part of it is you don't have to respond to every single thing, right? Is it possible that you've seen a theme in conversations and you're like, okay, let me figure out how to respond to this thing that's happening, rather than chasing everything that happens every day, because it's just not going to work. So can you start writing something and have it sort of like percolating? And when you have a chance to send it out or to update it, to do that. But it's impossible to constantly be chasing the stories of the day, especially if your work is in a lab somewhere, or if you're holed up with a bunch of books and no lights on. I don't know how people read. So don't feel the need to run after the stories. Keep doing the work, start writing things. I have lots of notes of things I want to write. Have something like that. And so when you have the chance to then have it come out, that you'll have something. But I just want to invite you to not sort of chase, because it's not going to work.
Yeah, and I agree to what you both have said. I think I think part of the chase, this urgency, I think contributes a lot to the misinformation, disinformation. Rather than try to be first, it's best to be accurate and submit the best piece that you can. Know that if the angle that seems to be the immediate angle has passed you by, find a different way to get to what you're trying to communicate. Oftentimes, as you'll see, these stories come back up, these topics continue to evolve, they cycle back. So just be at the ready, keep your notes, and start writing. And when the moment is right, the time is propitious, just go out there and share your story.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we can also create those opportunities for ourselves, right? So if we have a book coming out or a series of articles on the same topic that's been out, those are also excellent ways to then turn that research into op-eds and find the right home for that, and you sort of create your own moments rather than only responding to current events and just sort of feeling like you're have to just put out fire after fire after fire.
Absolutely. And one quick thing to add, just keep in mind it's a multi-platform world.
Mhm.
There's op-eds, podcasts, there's lots of ways to communicate, and it's finding that lane for yourself that works for yourself. It could be TMZ, right? So you still get out there and you get to share your story and people get to know who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a question about that too, right? So I think
Mhm.
when I was coming up back in my day, I feel that way now. Like I would never like tweet data. I would never right sort of put out my stuff like that. But I think now a lot of people don't have time to read things. And so if you are someone who's super savvy at that, like that can be something. There's, someone asked about someone asked about podcasts, but if that's your thing, that's your thing. I have a colleague, this brilliant colleague, who's now at University of Michigan. You got lucky. But she does work on feminism and gaming. And her stuff is very public. She writes and she'll be in an argument and she's citing stuff in the argument. So she's very, very public facing. And for her, that's really quite purposeful because she's mastered the craft. So it is possible to intervene outside of the outlets that we have shared. Just make sure that you know what you're doing and that you practice a level of safety because people do have these things come back to attack you. So if you get bored, you can also look up Kashana Gray, who does phenomenal work, and you can find her on
Amazing work.
all the internet. She's out there, so she's one really great model of using social media to share information in real time.
Yeah. And I'll just throw in because I did see the question about, using like TikTok and Instagram Reels, and there are a lot of people who do that and do it really, really well. And so if that is something you're considering doing, I would just say find people that you admire and that you think that the way that they do it is great, and then tweak it to match your style because we know that things like YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels and those TikTok Reels really just get to people quickly in ways that maybe an op-ed or a podcast episode can't. Yeah. Um, well, thank you all so much for this incredibly informative conversation. If anything that was said today has sparked your interest in writing for Spark, no pun intended, please join us for our workshop on August 13th at noon on developing pitch ideas for Spark. The registration link is in the chat, but we will also be sending out a follow-up email with more information and the registration link. And as we wrap up today, you'll see that I'd like to acknowledge Spark, the National Center for Institutional Diversity, and the University of Michigan for hosting this webinar today. I'd also like to take a minute to shout out two people whose names you've been seeing on the screen, but whose faces you have not. One is our amazing managing editor at Spark, Laura Sanchez Parkinson, and the other is Portia Jackson, who has helped us run today's webinar and does a lot of just behind the scenes work for us here at Spark as well. And just a big, huge thank you to both of them because we literally would not be here right now if it wasn't for the two of them. And then finally, thank you again to our fantastic panelists and all of the amazing, amazing advice and feedback you've provided today. Thank you to everyone on the webinar for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.